The Hunt for Ted Bundy, Part 2. On the night of August 16, 1975, Bob Haywood, a highway patrol officer, was driving home from a police conference in Seattle when he spotted a tan Volkswagen Beetle speeding past him on the highway. Bob had been a police officer for over 20 years, and he'd pulled over his fair share of speeders. So without giving it much thought, he turned on his flashing lights and pulled the Beetle over to the side of the road. When Bob approached the car, the driver rolled down his window and said, "Is there a problem, officer? I didn't know I was speeding." Bob could see that the driver had long dark hair that fell over his face, and that his passenger was hiding in the back seat. "Get out of the car, sir, and I'll tell you what the problem is." The man stepped out of the car and Bob searched the vehicle. He found several items that made no sense to him, like women's clothing, a ski mask, and some handcuffs. But he couldn't think of any laws they'd broken, so he let the man get back in the car and warned him to slow down. But as soon as he turned away, the man floored it and sped off. Bob jumped back into his cruiser and chased after him. The man drove straight into an abandoned gas station and stopped. He put the car in park and slowly raised his hands above his head. As Bob approached, the man said, "You won. You can take me to jail," before putting his hands back on the steering wheel. This was strange behavior. Why would anyone willingly give up after speeding? And why did he have all those bizarre items in his car? Bob radioed for backup and asked for the man to be placed under arrest for attempting to flee. And then he walked back to his cruiser. That's when he noticed something very disturbing. The man who had surrendered was missing, and his Volkswagen Beetle was now filled with clothes and other personal belongings. Where did he go? Bob looked around and spotted footprints leading into the woods behind the gas station. He followed them, but lost them near a creek. The man had vanished and would not be seen for months. In fact, the man who got away from the police that day was Ted Bundy, one of America's most infamous serial killers. Despite being just a few minutes away from capturing Bundy, Bob Haywood would never realize the significance of the man he had detained. At the time, the concept of a serial killer, someone who murders multiple people with a cooling-off period between the crimes, was not yet fully recognized. Serial murder was only added to the FBI's lexicon of terms in 1980. As such, police officers like Bob had no idea that the man they were pursuing was a mass murderer. The real reason Ted Bundy was driving a stolen car, wearing women's clothes and carrying a ski mask was because he had just kidnapped a woman named Karen Sparks. And as for the handcuffs, well, they belonged to the last person he had killed. But Bob didn't know any of that. To him, the only crime Ted had committed that night was speeding. And since he couldn't find any evidence of any other crimes, he eventually forgot about the case and went back to his normal routine. It wasn't until February of 1976 that Bob learned what really happened that night. By then, Ted Bundy had been arrested and charged with breaking and entering and kidnapping. While searching Bundy's house, the police found a trove of evidence that linked him to the murders of several women. They took Ted back to the station house where he confessed to 30 homicides, saying, "I'm going to tell you everything. I killed 10 in Utah, 5 in Colorado, 4 in Washington, 3 in Oregon, and 2 in California." Even though Ted was finally caught, he managed to evade justice for several more years. This was due to the fact that DNA testing was widely used at the time, and that different police departments rarely communicated with each other. For example, when Ted was arrested for stealing a Volkswagen Beetle in Colorado, the Salt Lake City Police Department, where Ted had abducted several women, didn't even receive a memo. It wasn't until Bundy was brought to trial that people realized how many lives he destroyed. While Ted was awaiting trial for the crimes he committed in Colorado, people came forward from all over the country to say that he fit the description of their loved one's killer. But despite having all that evidence against him, Ted managed to fool everyone, except the jury. In fact, he represented himself in court and almost convinced the jury that he was innocent. Even after the jury found him guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder, Ted appealed the verdict and represented himself once again. It wasn't until he was sentenced to death that Ted finally admitted to the crimes. "I've always tried to convince myself that what I did wasn't real, but now I know better. I've been trying to run away from my destiny, but no matter where I go, it will always be with me." On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Ted's crimes shocked the nation, and people everywhere wondered how on earth he managed to fool the police for so long. Well, as it turns out, Ted made one very crucial mistake. that may have saved many lives. On November 8, 1974, Ted decided to go on a killing spree in Colorado. His first victim was a young woman named Linda Ann Healy. He hit her over the head with a crowbar and left her for dead, but as it turned out, she survived. She ran to a nearby tavern and told the patrons that she had been attacked by a man driving a Volkswagen Beetle. Unbeknownst to Ted, a local police officer heard her story and filed the information away. A short while later, he received a call about a woman who matched Linda's description, saying that she had been assaulted by a man in a Volkswagen Beetle. He looked over his notes and realized that the descriptions were identical. Unfortunately, by the time he contacted the investigating officers, Ted had already gotten away. If this information had been shared with Bob Haywood, the manhunt could have ended a lot sooner. But at the time, police forces didn't communicate like that. As we mentioned, Bob didn't even know that the word serial killer existed. As such, he didn't even suspect that a manhunt was underway. If he had known, he definitely would have held on to the mysterious driver a little longer. But the fact that Ted managed to escape means that others didn't know about the crime spree either. Otherwise, they likely would have done the same thing. Now, if modern forensic techniques had been used from the start, many of Ted's victims might still be alive today. In fact, fingerprint analysis was first introduced in the United States in 1892, and a century later, DNA profiling became the standard in criminal trials. Yet neither of these technologies were used to catch Ted Bundy. One reason was money. At the time, many police departments couldn't afford the technology. For example, DNA testing machines are extremely expensive and cost millions of dollars. But another reason was training. Even if police departments could have afforded the technology, they didn't have the personnel to use it properly. Many officers hadn't even heard of serial killers and wouldn't have known what to do with the evidence anyway. In fact, the first national database of DNA profiles wasn't created until 1990, a year after Ted Bundy died. Even if the police had access to all these resources, it doesn't mean they would have been able to solve the case. After all, Ted Bundy was a master manipulator who could fool even the smartest people. There are many theories about what made Ted such a good manipulator. Some say that he was a psychopath who lacked remorse and empathy. Others say that he was just an ordinary guy who got caught up in the thrill of the hunt. Whatever the case, Ted was able to manipulate the police for years. He knew how to make himself look innocent and vulnerable. Even though he was anything but, Ted was also highly intelligent and had a photographic memory. This meant that he could remember every detail of his crimes and use it against his accusers. In one case, he was able to convince a jury that he was in the state where the crime took place at the time of the murder. He backed up his alibi by describing in detail the layout of the apartment he was staying in, which he had apparently memorized. To make matters worse, Ted often targeted victims who were young, attractive women. This made people less suspicious of him, because he seemed like the type of person who would hurt a fly. Additionally, Ted often went to great lengths to cover up his crimes. He would dispose of his victims' bodies in remote locations and sometimes even put them in concrete. This made it difficult for the police to find physical evidence, which further allowed Ted to evade justice. Despite the challenges, the police eventually caught up with Ted and brought him to justice. However, his crimes had a devastating impact on the families of his victims. Many people still wonder what could have been done differently to prevent the tragedy. Perhaps, if the police had been more aware of the signs of a serial killer, they could have apprehended Ted sooner. Or maybe if they had access to modern forensic techniques, they could have solved the case more easily. Whatever the case may be, the legacy of Ted Bundy continues to haunt the United States and serve as a reminder of the dangers of serial killers. Do you think Ted Bundy would have been caught sooner if modern forensic techniques had been used? Let us know your thoughts. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the video. Now go out, have fun, and be safe.